Okay. Here we go. So, this is weird and boring, but I'm reading from Richard Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. So, let's continue. The quest for the historical sublime, for proximity to some event such as the closing of the gap between subject and object, or the advent of the Superman, or the end of metaphysics, leads Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger to fancy themselves in the role of the last philosopher. The attempt to be in this position is the attempt to write something which will make it impossible for one to be redescribed except in one's own terms. Make it impossible to become an element in anybody else's beautiful pattern. One more little thing. To try for the sublime is to try not just to create the taste by which one judges oneself, but to make it impossible for anybody else to judge one by any other taste. Proust would have been quite content to think that he might serve as an element in other people's beautiful patterns. It pleased him to think that he might play for some successor the role which one of his precursors, say Balzac or Saint-Simon, had played for him. But that thought is, sometimes, more than an ironist theorist like Nietzsche can bear. Consider the contrast between Nietzsche's defenses of perspectivalism and his polemics against reactiveness. As long as he is busy relativizing and historicizing his predecessors, Nietzsche is happy to redescribe them as webs of relations to historical events, social conditions, their own predecessors, and so on. At these moments, he is faithful to his own conviction that the self is not a substance, and that we should drop the whole idea of substance, of something that cannot be perspectivalized, because it has a real essence, a privileged perspective on itself. But at other moments, the moments when he is imagining a Superman who will not be just a bundle of idiosyncratic reactions to past stimuli, but will be pure self-creation, pure spontaneity. At these moments, he forgets all about his perspectivalism. When he starts explaining how to be wonderful and different and unlike anything that has ever existed, he talks about human selves as if they were reservoirs of something called will to power. The Superman has an immense reservoir of this stuff, and Nietzsche's own is presumably pretty big. Nietzsche, the perspectivalist, is interested in finding a perspective from which to look back on the perspectives he inherited in order to see a beautiful pattern. That Nietzsche can be modeled, as Nietzsche models him on Proust, that he can be seen as having created himself as the author of his books. That Nietzsche, the one that we just described, can be modeled, as Nietzsche models him on Proust. He can be seen as having created himself as the author of his books. But Nietzsche the theorist of the will to power, the Nietzsche whom Heidegger attacked as the last metaphysician, is just as interested as Heidegger himself was in getting beyond all perspectives. He wants sublimity, not just beauty. If Nietzsche had been able to think of the canon of great dead philosophers in the way that Proust thought of the people he happened to meet, he would not have been tempted to be a theorist. He would not have striven for sublimity, would have escaped Heidegger's criticism and lived up to Kierkegaard's and Nietzsche's expectations. He would have been a Kierkegaard without Christianity, one who remained self-consciously aesthetic in Kierkegaard's sense of the term. If he had been faithful to his own perspectivalism and anti-essentialism, he would have avoided the temptation into which Hegel fell. That was the temptation of thinking that once you have found a way to subsume your predecessors under a general idea, you have thereby done something more than found a redescription of them, a redescription which has proved useful for your own purposes of self-creation. If you go on to conclude that you have found a way to make yourself quite different from those predecessors, to do something quite different from what they did, then you are doing what Heidegger called relapsing into metaphysics. For now you are claiming that none of the descriptions that applied to them applies to you, that you are separated from them by an abyss. You are acting as if a redescription of one's predecessors got one in touch with a power other than oneself, something capitalized, being, truth, history, absolute knowledge, or the will to power. This was Heidegger's point when he called Nietzsche, quote, merely an inverted Platonist, end quote. The same urge to affiliate with somebody bigger, which had led Plato to reify being, led Nietzsche to try to affiliate himself with becoming and power. Proust had no such temptation. At the end of his life, he saw himself as looking back along a temporal axis, watching colors, sounds, things, and people fall into place from the perspective of his own most recent description of them. He did not see himself as looking down upon the sequence of temporal events from above, as having ascended from a perspectival to a non-perspectival mode of description. Theoria was no part of his ambition. He was a perspectivalist who did not have to worry about whether perspectivalism was a true theory. So, the lesson I draw from Proust's example is that novels are a safer medium than theory for expressing one's recognition of the relativity and contingency of authority figures. For novels are usually about people, things which are, unlike general ideas and final vocabularies, quite evidently time-bound, embedded in a web of contingencies. Since the characters in novels age and die, since they obviously share the finitude of the books in which they occur, we are not tempted to think that by adopting an attitude toward them, we have adopted an attitude toward every possible sort of person. By contrast, books which are about ideas, even when written by historicists like Hegel and Nietzsche, look like descriptions of eternal relations between eternal objects, rather than genealogical accounts of affiliation of final vocabularies, showing how these vocabularies were engendered by haphazard matings, by who happened to bump into whom. The contrast I have been drawing between Proust and Nietzsche raises the central problem which Heidegger tried to solve, namely, how can we write a historical narrative about metaphysics, about successive attempts to find a redescription of the past which the future will not be able to redescribe, without ourselves becoming metaphysicians? How can we tell a historical narrative which ends with oneself, without looking as ridiculous as Hegel made himself look? How can one be a theorist, write a narrative of ideas rather than people, which does not pretend to a sublimity which one's own narrative rules out? Although Nietzsche is full of talk about a new day, a new way, a new soul, a new man, his eagerness to burst the limits set by the past is sometimes mitigated by his rueful awareness of Hegel's pratfall, and more generally by his sense of the disadvantages of too much historical consciousness for life. Nietzsche realizes that somebody who wants to create himself cannot afford to be too Apollonian. In particular, he cannot initiate Kant's attempt to survey the entire realm of possibility from above. For the idea of a fixed, unchangeable realm of possibility is hard to combine with the idea that one might, by one's own efforts, enlarge that realm, not simply take one's place within a predetermined scheme, but change the scheme. An ironist theorist is caught in a dilemma between saying he has actualized the last possibility left open and saying that he has created not just a new actuality, but new possibilities. The demands of theory require him to say the former. The demands of self-creation require him to say the latter. That's interesting. Nietzsche is a confusing, instructive study in the tension between these two demands, a tension which comes out in the strain the attempt to see himself as world historical put on Nietzsche's boundless sense of humor, the strain wrought on his desire to be utterly novel by his realization that ambition was by now rather old-fashioned. But the humorless Heidegger is nevertheless the figure who tells us the most about this tension. He was far more self-conscious and explicit about the dilemma I have just put forward than either Hegel or Nietzsche was, and indeed was obsessed with it. It is not much of an exaggeration to say that at the resolution of this dilemma, It is not much of an exaggeration to say that the resolution of this dilemma gradually became, in the course of the 1930s, Heidegger's central concern. In the mid-20s, Heidegger could still quite unselfconsciously project his own problem about how to be an ironist theorist onto something large, Dasein, by identifying guilt in a deep ontological sense. With the fact that one had not created oneself. Dasein as such is guilty, he tells us. Schuldig. For Dasein is continually pursued by the call of conscience, which reminds it that it is being pursued by its own uncanniness, the uncanniness which is the basic kind of being in the world, even though in an everyday way it has been covered up. Authenticity is the recognition of this uncanniness. It is achieved only by those who realize that they are thrown, realize that they cannot, at least not yet, say to the past, "Thus I willed it." For Heidegger, early and late, what one is the practices one engages in, and especially the language, the final vocabulary one uses. For that vocabulary determines what one can take as a possible project. So to say that Dasein is guilty is to say that it speaks somebody else's language, and so lives in a world it never made, a world which, just for this reason, is not its Heim. It is guilty because its final vocabulary is just something which it was thrown into, the language that happened to be spoken by the people among whom it happened to grow up. Most people would not feel guilty about this. But people with the special gifts and ambitions shared by Hegel, Proust, and Heidegger do. So, the simplest answer to the question, what does Heidegger mean by the word Dasein, is people like himself. People who are unable to stand the thought that they are not their own creations. These are the people who immediately see the point of Blake's exclamation, quote, "I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's," end quote. Or, more exactly, such people are authentic Dasein, Dasein that knows it is Dasein, that it is only contingently there, where it is, speaking as it does. Heidegger seems seriously to have thought, when he was writing Being and Time, that he was carrying out a transcendental project, namely, giving an accurate list of the ontological conditions of possibility of merely ontic states. He seems genuinely to have believed that the ordinary states of mind and life, and the life plans of non-intellectuals were grounded on the ability of people like himself and Blake to have spectacularly different anxieties and projects. He tells us with a straight face, for example, that guilt, as defined above, is a condition of the possibility of, for instance, feeling guilty because you have not yet paid back a monetary debt. Just as Kant seems never to have asked himself how, given the restrictions on human cognition the Critique of Pure Reason had discerned, it was possible to assume the transcendental standpoint from which that book was written, so the Heidegger of this period never looks into the question of methodological self-reference. He never asks himself how the ontology of the sort he was busy producing was, given its own conclusions, possible. In remarking on this early unself-consciousness, I am not trying to denigrate Heidegger's early, intellectually inconsistent, hastily written, brilliantly original book. Heidegger was, after all, not the first philosopher to have taken his own idiosyncratic spiritual situation for the essence of what it was to be human. The first clear case of a philosopher who did so is Plato, the first Western philosopher whose works survive. Rather, I am pointing out that there were excellent reasons for Heidegger in the course of the 1930s to cease using the words Dasein, ontology, and phenomenology, and to stop talking about the conditions of possibility of various emotions and situations. He had excellent reason to stop talking as if his subject was something like the kind of thing all human beings really are deep down, and to start talking explicitly about what really bothered him, his own particular private indebtedness to particular past philosophers, his own fear that their vocabularies might have enslaved him, his terror that he would never succeed in creating himself. From the time when he becomes preoccupied with Nietzsche, who had barely gotten a look in Being and Time, until his death, Heidegger concentrates on the question, how can I avoid being one more metaphysician, one more footnote on Plato? The first answer he gives to this question is to change his description of what he wants to write from phenomenological ontology to the history of being. The history of a few dozen thinkers, people who created themselves, and the ensuing ages of the world, by embodying a new understanding of being, Seinsverständnis. All these thinkers were metaphysicians in that they all invoked some form of the Greek appearance-reality distinction. Excuse me. They all envisaged themselves as getting closer to something, the real, which already awaited them. Even Nietzsche, treated, as Heidegger insisted on treating him, as the theorist of the will to power as ultimate reality, was a metaphysician, albeit the last metaphysician, because the one who performed the only remaining transformation of Plato, inverting him so as to make the real consist in that which Plato had identified as appearance. This redescription of the past, he has a long footnote here about Jürgen Habermas, which I am going to skip. It looks like... Oh, no, we're not going to skip this one. It's where he talks about Heidegger being a Nazi. Ooh, spicy. Habermas takes the switch from phenomenological ontology to history of being to be the result of Heidegger's involvement with the Nazis. In The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, Habermas says, quote, I suspect that Heidegger could find his way to the temporalized Ursprungsphilosophie of the later period only by way of his temporary identification with the National Socialist movement, to whose inner truth and greatness he still attested in 1935, end quote. Later, Habermas says that Heidegger wanted to blame his blindness to the nature of the Nazi movement on, quote, a sublimated history promoted to the lofty heights of ontology. Thus was born the concept of the history of being, end quote. But a great deal of the story that Heidegger told in the late 30s and 40s about the history of being was prefigured in his 1927 lectures on, quote, the basic problems of phenomenology, and presumably would have made up part 2 of Being in Time if that book had ever been completed. Even if the Nazis had not come to power, and if Heidegger had never dreamed of becoming Hitler's Eminence grise, I suspect that the turn, die Kehre, would have been taken. One important feature of the history of being, which is not present in the 1920s, is the claim that it exhausts its possibilities with Nietzsche. So my hunch is that the crucial details of the sublimated history promoted to the lofty heights of ontology were fixed not only on the day Heidegger asked himself, quote, how will I look to history in my Nazi uniform, end quote, but rather on the day he asked himself, quote, will history see me as just one more disciple of Nietzsche's, end quote. Habermas is certainly right that Heidegger needed to find some excuse for his Nazism, and that he wove a thoroughly unconvincing self-exculpation into the story he proceeded to tell, true. But on my view, it is a story which he would have written anyway, even if he had less to excuse himself for. On the general question of the relation between Heidegger's thought and his Nazism, I am not persuaded that there is much to be said, except that one of the century's most original thinkers happened to be a pretty nasty character. He was the sort of man who could betray his Jewish colleagues for the sake of his own ambition and then manage to forget what he had done. But if one holds the view of the self as centerless, which I put forward in Chapter 2, one will be prepared to find the relation between the intellectual and the moral virtues, and the relation between a writer's books and their other parts of life, contingent. That's the end of the footnote. We continue. Since that was like a page of footnote, where we left off, he says, even Nietzsche, treated as Heidegger insisted on treating him as the theorist of the will to power as ultimate reality, was a metaphysician, albeit the last metaphysician, because the one who performed the only remaining transformation of Plato to invert him so as to make the real consist in that with which Plato had identified appearance. So Nietzsche finally inverts Platonism. It makes appearance the primary thing, the fundamental real. And so he's the last metaphysician because there's nothing left to like replace or invert or turn upside down. Okay, now we continue. This redescription of the past, and in particular of Nietzsche, this description of the West as the place where Platonism inverted itself and ended up as the will to power, enabled Heidegger to picture himself as a thinker of a new kind. He wanted to be neither a metaphysician nor an ironist, but to combine the advantages of both. He spent much of his time giving the pejorative sense to the term metaphysics, which Derrida subsequently picked up from him and popularized, the sense I have been employing in this book. But he also spent a lot of time being scornful of the aestheticist, pragmatist light-mindedness of the ironists. He thought of them as dilettantish characters who lacked the high seriousness of the great metaphysicians, their special relation to being. As a Schwarzwald redneck, so mean. As a Schwarzwald redneck, he had an ingrained. Heidegger was from this like tiny cow town in southern Germany called Meßkirch. Even today, it's this like little village that has, I don't know, a couple dozen buildings, and then it's just cornfields or whatever they grow down there. And Heidegger is actually buried in a field next to his wife, just on farmland. It's wild. So he's kind of a hick, is what Rorty is being so mean about. Okay, as a Schwarzwald redneck, he had an ingrained dislike of North German cosmopolitan mandarins. As a philosopher, he viewed the rise of the ironist intellectuals, many of them Jews, as symptomatic of the degeneracy of what he called the age of the world picture. He thought the ironist culture of our century, the high culture in which Proust and Freud are central figures, merely the unthinking self-satisfaction of a post-metaphysical nihilism. So he wanted to find a way of being neither metaphysical nor aestheticist. He wanted to see metaphysics as the true and fateful destiny of Europe, rather than simply brushing it off, as both Proust and Freud did. Excuse me. But he also wanted to insist that metaphysics, and therefore Europe, were now over. For, now that Plato had been fully inverted, metaphysics had exhausted its possibilities. For Heidegger, this task presented itself as the task of how to work within a final vocabulary, while somehow simultaneously bracketing that vocabulary, to keep the seriousness of its finality while letting it itself express its own contingency. He wanted to construct a vocabulary which would both constantly dismantle itself and constantly take itself seriously. Hegel's and Nietzsche's historicist perspectivism had led in the direction of this problem, but Hegel had ducked it by talking as if absolute knowledge were just around the corner, and as if language were just a dispensable mediation which the final union of subject and object would supersede. Nietzsche, in turn, had fobbed us off with the suggestion that the Superman would somehow get along without any vocabulary. Nietzsche vaguely suggests that the child who, in Zarathustra's parable, succeeds the lion, who in turn had succeeded the camel, will somehow have all the advantages of thought, with none of the disadvantages of speaking some particular language. That's interesting. Heidegger, to his credit, did not duck the problem. He did not abandon nominalism in favor of non-linguistic ineffability when the chips were down. Instead, he made a daring, outrageous suggestion about what philosophy might be in an ironist age. In Being in Time is a sentence which I think describes his ambition both before and after Die Kehrle, the turn. Quote, "The ultimate business of philosophy is to persevere the force of the most elementary words in which Dasein expresses itself, and to keep the common understanding from leveling them off to that unintelligibility which functions as a source of pseudo-problems." That almost sounds like Wittgenstein. That's crazy. He says, what was it? "The ultimate business of philosophy is to preserve. Sorry, I got that word wrong. The ultimate business of philosophy is to preserve the force of the most elementary words in which Dasein expresses itself, and to keep the common understanding from leveling them off to that unintelligibility which functions as a source of pseudo-problems. This goes back to this thing that I always think of in Nietzsche, where he says that truths are based on metaphors that we've forgotten were metaphors, that we literalize, which is actually a core theme in this book earlier on. Okay, anyway. The first set of candidates for most elementary words Heidegger offered were words like Dasein, Sorge, and Befindlichkeit, and the new uses which he assigned them when writing Being and Time. During the Kehre, in the course of what I imagine to have been his gradual realization that the jargon of that book and its transcendental pretensions made it a tempting target for Kierkegaardian Nietzschean ridicule, he offered a second set of candidates, the emblematic words used by the great dead metaphysicians, words like noein, physis, and substantia. He shifted into Greek, somehow got more pretentious. But it's more alienated from the current philosophical vocabulary, so it becomes this sort of amorphous thing. Sorry, I'm commenting. Redefined by Heidegger to suit his purpose of showing that all these metaphysicians had, appearances to the contrary, been trying to express a sense of Dasein's finitude. He has a long footnote that's super technical and includes a bunch of German quotes, so I'm going to skip it. Both sets of words have irony built in. They are all supposed to express authentic Dasein's sense of self as unable to get along without a final vocabulary, while aware that no vocabulary can remain final in its sense of its own metastability. Well, that sentence just washed over me. Let me read that again. Both sets of words have irony built in, so the first set and the second set. They are all supposed to express authentic Dasein's sense of itself as unable to get along without a final vocabulary, while aware that no vocabulary can remain final, its sense of its own metastability. Dasein was, so to speak, Heidegger's name for the ironist. But in his later period, this word is replaced by Europe, or the West, the personification of the place where being played out a destiny, which ended in ironism. For the later Heidegger, to talk about ironism is to talk about the penultimate stage in the story of Europe, the stage which immediately precedes Heidegger, and of which he made Nietzsche a symbol, the stage in which the world becomes view, as the intellectuals and gradually everyone else realize that anything can be made to look good or bad, interesting or boring, by being recontextualized, redescribed. In my reading of him, all of Heidegger's most elementary words are words designed to express the predicament of the ironist theorist, the tension which Nietzsche and Hegel felt but shrugged off and which Heidegger takes with full seriousness. All these words are supposed to encapsulate the difficulty of being theoretic and ironic at the same time. Heidegger is thus writing about himself, his own predicament, when he claims to be writing about somebody else's, Europe's. What binds early to late Heidegger is the hope of finding a vocabulary which will keep him authentic, one which will block any attempt to affiliate oneself with a higher power, to achieve a ktema eis aie. I have no idea what that means. I don't know what ktema is. But eis aie means into eternity. Anyway, if you know Greek, maybe you know what ktema is. To escape from time... Oh, okay. An escape into eternity. He glosses it. Shoot. Okay. What binds early to late Heidegger is the hope of finding a vocabulary which will keep him authentic, one which will block any attempts to affiliate oneself with a higher power, to achieve a ktema eis aie, to escape from time into eternity. He wants words which cannot be leveled off, which cannot be used as if they were part of the right final vocabulary. He wants a self-consuming and continually self-renewing final vocabulary, words which will make clear that they are not representations of real essence, not ways of getting in touch with a higher power, not themselves instruments of power or means to ends, not attempts to evade Dasein's responsibility of self-creation. He wants words which will, so to speak, do his work for him, relieve him of the tension he feels by taking that tension on themselves. So he has to adopt a view of language which is not only anti-Wittgensteinian, but also anti-Lockean, a view which has been unfamiliar since speculation about an Adamic language petered out in the 17th century. For Heidegger, philosophical truth depends upon the very choice of phonemes, on the very sounds of words. It's true, Heidegger does all this bullshit etymology, and he gives the roots of words, and even puns that you can make on them in German or Greek, philosophically significant in fairly implausible ways. Okay. But, oh gosh, it's midnight. Well, whatever. We're going to keep going. It is easy to take this view as a reductio ad absurdum of Heidegger's project. But one can see its attractions if one sees the difficulty of the problem Heidegger had set himself, the problem of how to surpass place and set aside all past theory without oneself theorizing. In his own jargon, this comes across as the problem of talking about being without talking about what all beings have in common. Talking in this latter way is, on Heidegger's definition, the essence of metaphysics. The problem of whether his own purportedly non-theoretic jargon is all that different from other people's confessedly theoretic jargon comes through for Heidegger as the problem of how, quote, to touch upon the nature of language without doing it injury, end quote. More specifically, it is the problem of how to keep hints and gestures, Winke und Gebärden, distinct from the signs and chiffres, Zeichen und Chiffren, I don't know what that word means, of metaphysics. How, for example, to prevent the phrase house of being, one of Heidegger's descriptions of language, from being taken as a mere hasty image which helps us in imagining what we will. The only solution to such problems is, do not put Heidegger's words in any context, do not treat them as movable pieces in a game, or as tools, or as relevant to any question save Heidegger's own. In short, give his words a privilege you extend to a lyric, which you love too much to treat it as an object of literary criticism, a lyric which you recite, but do not, for fear of injuring, relate to anything else. An uninterpreted, uninterpretable, unrelated text that has no meaning. That was me, sorry. Only if the phonemes, the sounds, matter does such a plea make sense. For if they did not matter, then we would be free to treat Heidegger's words, the fragments of final vocabulary which he developed for himself, as counters in a language game which people other than himself could get in on. We would be able to treat even terms like Haus des Seins, the house of being, in the contextual way made familiar by Saussure and Wittgenstein, as a more or less useful tool for some purpose which is extraneous to the term itself. But if we do that, we shall eventually be driven back on the questions, what is the point of playing the game in question? And for what purpose is this final vocabulary useful? The only available answer to both seems to be the one Nietzsche gave. It increases our power. It helps us get what we antecedently decided we want. Heidegger thinks that if we are to avoid this identification of truth with power, to avoid the sort of humanism and pragmatism advocated in this book, Rorty's own book, forms of thought which he took to be the most degraded versions of the nihilism in which metaphysics culminates, we have to say that final vocabularies are not just means to ends, but indeed houses of being. But this claim requires him to poeticize philosophical language by letting the phonemes matter, not just the uses to which phonemes are put. Most contemporary objections to Wittgensteinian views of language and pragmatist views of truth come from realist philosophers, for example, Wilfrid Sellars, Bernard Williams, who argue that physical science is privileged over other parts of discourse. For Heidegger, this gets things exactly the wrong way around. On his view, pragmatism, Wittgensteinian, and physical science, On Heidegger's view, pragmatism, Wittgenstein, and physical science deserve one another. Heidegger thinks it is poetry rather than physics which allows the inadequacy of a language game account which shows the inadequacy of a language game account of language. Consider one of his examples of unparaphrasability, the occurrence of the word ist in Goethe's line, "Über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhe," which is above all the steeples or above all the peaks, there is peace. There seems to be something wrong with trying to construe this ist as an instrument for accomplishing a purpose. It can, of course, be so construed, and Heidegger gives us no argument why it should not be. But he wants us to consider the question, given that there seems something wrong with so construing it, what would language have to be if there were something wrong? His answer is that there would have to be certain elementary words which have force apart from their use by what he calls the common understanding. The common understanding is what a language game theory catches, but force is what the idea of the house of being is supposed to help us catch. If no words had force, there would be no need for philosophy as the attempt to preserve that force. The account of what Heidegger meant by the phrase, the ultimate business of philosophy, raises the obvious question, how does Heidegger know an elementary word when he sees one, a word that has force rather than just use? If he is as finite, as bound to time and place as the rest of us, how can he claim to be able to recognize an elementary word when he hears one without turning back into a metaphysician? We can get a clue to his answer from a line in one of the few poems he published, although apparently he wrote many. Quote, "Being's poem, Man, is just begun." End quote. He thinks of man, or rather European man, as the person whose life has been spent in passing from certain vital vocabularies to certain others. So if you want to pick out elementary words, you write a Bildungsroman about a character called Europe, trying to spot the crucial transitions in Europe's life. Think of Heidegger as doing the sort of thing for Being's poem, which a critic might try to do for poetry in English. A sufficiently ambitious critic, such as Harold Bloom, constructs a canon not only of poets, but also of poems and of lines within poems, trying to identify just which lines of which poems opened up or closed off options for the successor poets. The most elemental lines of English poetry are the ones which determine the historical position in which a 20th century poet writing in English finds himself. They are the house in which he lives, not the tool he uses. Such a critic writes a Bildungsroman about how English poetry came to be what it now is. Heidegger is writing a Bildungsroman about, in his phrase, what being now is. He tries to identify the philosophers and the words which have been decisive for getting Europe to the point where it now is. He wants to give us a genealogy of final vocabularies which will show us why we are currently using the final vocabulary we are, by telling a story about the theorists, Heraclitus, Aristotle, Descartes, and so on, whom we have to go through rather than around. But the criterion of choice of figures to discuss, and of elementary words to isolate, is not that the philosophers or the words are authorities on something other than themselves, on, for instance, being. They are not revealers of anything, except us the 20th century ironists. They reveal us because they made us. The most elementary words in which Dasein expresses itself are not most elemental in the sense that they are closer to how things are in themselves, but only in the sense that they are closer to us. In other words, the history of being starts in the present and shoots backwards like a ray, and the explanatory power and importance of things in the past is dependent on how they factor into our way of speaking now. I can summarize my story about Heidegger by saying that he hoped to avoid Nietzsche's relapse from irony into metaphysics, his final surrender to his desire for power, by giving us a litany rather than a narrative. He thoroughly understood Hegel's and Nietzsche's problem of how to end their narrative, and toward the end of his life, he hoped he had avoided the trap into which they fell by treating his narrative of the history of being as merely a ladder which could be thrown away, merely an artifice for bringing the elemental words to our attention. He wanted to help us hear the words which had made us what we are. We were to do this, he finally decided, not for the sake of overcoming anything, for example, Western ontology or ourselves, but rather for the sake of Gelassenheit, of the ability not to seek power, the ability not to wish to overcome. The analogies between Heidegger's attempt, so described, and Proust's attempt, as I described it earlier, are fairly obvious. Proust's effort to deprive the concept of authority, I feel like that's a typo. Proust's effort to deprive the concept of authority by redescribing all possible authorities as fellow sufferers is paralleled by Heidegger's attempt simply to hear the resonances of the words of the metaphysicians rather than to use these words as instruments. His description of what he was doing as andenkendes Denken, a thinking that recalls, makes the analogy with Proust still easier. Both he and Proust thought that if memory could retrieve what created us, that retrieval itself would be tantamount to becoming what one was. Having drawn this analogy, I can now explain what is wrong with it, why I think Heidegger failed where Proust succeeded. Proust succeeded because he had no public ambitions, no reason to believe that the sound of the name Guermantes would mean anything to anybody but his narrator. If that same name does in fact have resonance for lots of people nowadays, that is just because reading Proust's novel happens to have become, for those people, the same sort of thing which the walk à Côte de Guermantes happened to become for Marcel, an experience which they need to redescribe and thus to mesh with other experiences if they are to succeed in their project of self-creation. But Heidegger thought he knew some words which had, or should have had, resonance for everybody in modern Europe. Words which were relevant not just to the fate of people who happen to have read a lot of philosophy books, but to the public fate of the West. He was unable to believe that the words which meant so much to him, words like Aristotle, physis, Parmenides, Noen, Descartes, and substantia, were just his own private equivalents of Guermantes, Combray, and Gilbert. But that is, in fact, all they were. And Heidegger was the greatest theoretical imagination of his time, outside the natural sciences. He achieved the sublimity he attempted, but this does not prevent his being entirely useless to people who do not share his associations. For people like me, who do share them, he's an exemplary, gigantic, unforgettable figure. Reading Heidegger has become one of the experiences with which we have to come to terms. It's so true. Reading Heidegger has become one of the experiences with which we have to come to terms, to redescribe and to make mesh with the rest of our experiences, in order to succeed in our own projects of self-creation. But Heidegger has no general public utility. To people who have never read and were merely amused by the attempts of metaphysicians like Plato and Kant to affiliate themselves with an ahistorical power, Ironist theory seems an absurd overreaction to an empty threat. Such people will find Heidegger's Andenkendes Denken no more urgent a project than Uncle Toby's attempt to construct a model of the fortifications of Namur. Heidegger thought that he could, by virtue of his acquaintance with certain books, pick out certain words. I honestly cannot believe anybody is watching me read this book, but I'm enjoying it, so cool. Maybe you are too. Heidegger thought that he could, by virtue of his acquaintance with certain books, pick out certain words which stood to all contemporary Europeans as Marcel's litany of recollection stood to him. He could not. There is no such list of elementary words, no universal litany. The elementariness of elementary words, in Heidegger's sense of elementary, is a private and idiosyncratic matter. The list of books which Heidegger read is no more central to Europe and its destiny than a lot of other lists of a lot of other books, and the concept of the destiny of Europe is, in any case, one we can do without. For this sort of historicist dramaturgy is just a further attempt to fend off thoughts of mortality with thoughts of affiliation and incarnation. Heidegger was quite right in saying that poetry shows what language can be when it is not a means to an end, but quite wrong in thinking that there could be a universal poem. something which combined the best features of philosophy and poetry, something which lay beyond both metaphysics and ironism. Phonemes do matter, but no one phoneme matters to very many people for very long. Heidegger's definition of man as being's poem was a magnificent but hopeless attempt to save theory by poeticizing it. But neither man in general, nor Europe in particular, has a destiny, nor does either stand to any larger than human figure as a poem stands to its author. Nor is ironist theory more than one of the great literary traditions of modern Europe, comparable to the modern novel and the greatness of the achievements which exemplify it, though far less relevant to politics, social hope, or human solidarity. When Nietzsche and Heidegger stick to celebrating their personal canons, stick to the little things which meant the most to them, they are as magnificent as Proust. They are figures whom the rest of us can use as examples and as material in our own attempts to create a new self by writing a Bildungsroman about our old self. But as soon as either tries to put forward a view about modern society or the destiny of Europe or contemporary politics, he becomes at best vapid and at worst sadistic. When we read Heidegger as a philosophy professor, he managed to transcend his own condition by using the names and the words of the great dead metaphysicians as elements of a personal litany. He's an immensely sympathetic figure. But as a philosopher of our public life, as a commentator on 20th century technology and politics, he is resentful, petty, squint-eyed, obsessive, and at his occasional worst, as in his praise of Hitler after the Jews had been kicked out of the university, cruel. Gosh, and this was published long before the really bad stuff came out. This claim repeats a suggestion I made at the end of the preceding chapter, that irony is of little public use, and that ironist theory is, if not exactly a contradiction in terms, at least so different from metaphysical theory as to be incapable of being judged in the same terms. Metaphysics hoped to bring together our private and our public lives by showing us that self-discovery and political union could be united. The thing that he's referencing here... Oh, never mind. Okay. Metaphysics hope to bring together our private and our public lives by showing us that self-discovery and political utility could be united. It hoped to provide a final vocabulary which would not break apart into a private and a public portion. Over it. So the thing he's talking about, he discussed Plato a while back, and he's talking about the sort of peculiar project in the Republic of uniting the quest for political justice with the quest for self-fulfillment and moral perfection, the sort of trifecta. And he calls into question, why should we assume that these things have anything to do with each other? Why should we assume that this analogy between man's soul and the state exists? Why is that a valid analogy? Why should we depend so much on that? And then, So, okay, go on. Metaphysics hope to bring together our private and our public lives by showing us that self-discovery and political utility could be united. It hoped to provide a final vocabulary which would not break apart into a private and a public portion. It hoped to be both beautiful on a small private scale and sublime on a large public one. Ironist theory ran its course in the attempt to achieve the same synthesis through narrative rather than system, but the attempt was hopeless. Metaphysicians like Plato and Marx thought they could show that once philosophical theory had led us from appearance to reality, we would be in a better position to be useful to our fellow human beings. They both hoped that the public-private split, the distinction between duty to self and duty to others, could be overcome. Marxism has been the envy of all later intellectual movements because it seemed, for a moment, to show how to synthesize self-creation and social responsibility, pagan heroism, and Christian love, the detachment of the contemplative with the fervor of the revolutionary. On my account of ironist culture, such opposites can be combined in life, but not synthesized in a theory. We should stop looking for a successor to Marxism, for a theory which fuses decency and sublimity. Ironists should reconcile themselves to a public-private split within their final vocabularies, to the fact that the resolution of doubts about one's final vocabulary has nothing in particular to do with attempts to save other people from pain and humiliation. Colligation and redescription of the little things that are important to one, even if those little things are philosophy books, will not result in an understanding of anything larger than oneself, anything like Europe or history. We should stop trying to combine self-creation and politics, especially if we are liberals. The part of a liberal ironist's final vocabulary, which has to do with public action, is never going to get subsumed under or subsume the rest of her final vocabulary. I shall claim in Chapter 8 that liberal political discourse would do well to remain as untheoretical and simple-minded as it looks, and as Orwell thought it, no matter how sophisticated the discourse of self-creation becomes. That's the end of the chapter, and it's 12:30, so I'm going to stop. And it says I have to stop because I violated something. Bye.